Good afternoon and welcome to the Aula Magna, the Great Hall of the University of Padua, here at Palazzo del Bo. And welcome to those who are watching us live on the university's YouTube channel. A very warm welcome to Alvin Eliot Roth, who is the Craig and Susan McCaw Professor of Economics at Stanford University, and the winner, together with Lloyd Shapley, of the 2012 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. Professor Roth's lecture today is part of the celebrations for the 20th anniversary of the Galileian School for Higher Studies. I'll now invite you to watch a short video introducing the school.
Ognuno di noi è un tesoro, una combinazione unica di talenti e prospettive. Nel mondo frenetico di oggi, dove tutto sembra uguale, noi ci fermiamo per valorizzare la rarità individuale. La Scuola Galileiana è il luogo dove elementi brillanti si incontrano e si ispirano a vicenda vivendo uno spazio comune. Un luogo in cui il valore di ciascuno diventa esperienza collettiva da condividere col mondo. Qui ogni studente ha una voce, un ruolo ed un impatto. Dalle scienze umanistiche alle scienze naturali a quelle sociali, tutte le passioni sono incoraggiate e portate alla luce attraverso il pensiero critico. L'intelligenza ha bisogno di cure e attenzioni. Nella Scuola Galileiana, insegnanti e tutor lavorano con passione e competenza per guidare ciascuno alla scoperta del suo personale percorso. Raro è meglio di perfetto. Scopri la tua rarità alla Scuola Galileiana, dove ogni studente brilla in modo unico.
And now, opening the event is an address by Professor Antonio Parbonetti, Vice Rector of Organization and Budget.
All other events. I want to thank colleagues of the Scuola Galileiana and the departments for promoting and organizing these events. I think will be an important, this is an important event and will enrich all of us. I want to point out a few aspects. In every economic program, first year, first week, I think, all students learn that prices regulate the market. That's at the beginning, supply and demand. That's the standard approach you see in every class. Professor Roth showed us that not all markets are regulated by prices. And this is an important contribution to the economic theory, and actually an important contribution to the life of people, normal person. I think this is a good example of out-of-box thinking. Questioning a well-established idea was important to discover something new with a clear impact on people's life. To enter in this Aula Magna, in this great hall, you pass through the room of 40. Room of 40 show famous students of this university. Among them, you can recognize some very important names, William Harvey, De L'Hopital, and many others. So the list is 40 persons. If you look carefully, you see that out-of-box thinking at that point in time was having students from all over the world. No matter the religion, no matter the country of origin, no matter nationality, irrespective of religion and nationality, students and professors work together, considering what bond each other and not what divide us, looking to improve the quality of life of people, trying to build a better world. I think that in our complex world, with many conflicts and continuous changes the out-of-box thinking is important to be good researcher, discover something new, and to be also good citizens. I'm sure, Professor Roth, that your speech will be inspiring for all of us. Thanks. So I enjoy this speech at this event. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Parbonetti. Our next speaker is the director of the Galileian School for Higher Studies, Professor Gianguido Dall'Agata.
It is with great pleasure that I extend my greetings to all of you for this Nobel Lecture, which is part of the celebrations on the 20th anniversary of the Galileian School of Higher Education. The Galileian School of Higher Education is the school of excellence of our university, and it offers an educational path that, at the highest level, to be done in parallel with the normal university curriculum. Our school is characterized by academic excellence, a profound disciplinary knowledge, but also by interdisciplinary vocation. I think, therefore, that there is no better chance than this one to show how these aspects can be combined together. The lecture of Professor Slot, that I thank for accepting our invitation, will show indeed how you can excel in a discipline and at the same time influence so much of our society. His research in economics, in particular on market designs, had repercussions on the most diverse areas of social life. From the labor market to the allocation of social housing to the optimization of queues for kidney transplants. As I said, the Galileian School seeks excellence in the education of its students, but it wants to do so by striving to be open to the entire academic community and not only to the academic community. Now, entering its full maturity with its 20-year history, our school offers training and orientation opportunities at all levels, from colloquia, such as this one, to thematic and residential schools, to advanced training courses for secondary school teachers. Occasions in which the school seeks to be a living and active part of our university. I therefore thank you all again for sharing this moment with us, and I hope you will be able to come again in the future to participate to the next events that we will be able to offer. I thank again Professor Roth for being here, and I will now turn the floor to Professor Nicolò, who's the coordinator of the social sciences class in the Galileian School, and who made possible this event. Again, thank you all for being here, and have a nice lecture.
Thank you. As Professor Dall'Agata said, next on the stage is Professor Antonio Nicolò, who is the coordinator of the social science study class at the Galileian School for Higher Education.
Dear authorities, esteemed colleagues, dear students, audience, it is with great honor that we welcome to our university an intellectual giant in the field of economics, a thought leader whose groundbreaking work has reshaped our understanding of markets and mechanisms, Professor Alvin Eliot Roth. Professor Roth is not only a laureate of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science, which he was awarded in 2012 for his seminal work on the theory of stable allocation and the practice of market design, but he is also a mastermind who bridges theoretical insights with impactful real-world application. Professor Roth currently holds a position at Stanford University, where he continues to push the frontiers of economic science, encouraging us to rethink how we perceive choices, cooperation, and competition within our complex economic system. Professor Roth is what we could call the engineering economist. His work consists of designing and creating new markets that make it possible to allocate scarce resources more efficiently and equitably. Economics sometimes perceived as a science of price or money. Economics, in fact, is about how allocating scarce resources and to make them less scarce. Economists like prices because they are useful tools to transmit information about individual preference, economic cost. However, in several situations, such as school, university admission, organ donation, entry-level labor markets, for either legal or ethical reason, there is a need to find ways to allocate scarce resources that are alternative to prices. His work on the design of a national resident matching program, which matches medical residents with hospital, and the New England program for kidney exchange are just a few examples of how his theory have been successfully put into practices for the betterment of the society. Allow me now to share a personal anecdote illustrating why I hold such deep gratitude towards him. As some of you may be aware, my wife is a judge. And to our children, it has always been abundantly clear which parent they consider to be the more useful one. I recall an episode about 20 years ago, more or less. It's important to remember this date. When my eldest son, then 4 years old, we asked at preschool what his parents did. And the response was, "Mom decides who is right when people argue. Dad, I'm not sure. He seems to spend all the day on the computer." So I then realized that I should try to do something slightly more useful. And around that time, Professor Roth published his seminal paper on kidney exchange in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, exactly 20 years ago, on May 24, where he proposed the kidney exchange program aimed at increasing the number of kidney transplants. Thanks to this paper and subsequent work by Professor Roth and his colleagues, kidney exchange programs have been developed worldwide. Several economists have had the opportunity to work alongside policymakers to design new programs for school, university admission, as well for organ donation, with the potential to positively impact society's well-being. Personally, collaborating with my colleagues in the Kidney and Pancreas Transplant Unit of Padua, Professor Paolo Rigotti, Professor Lucrezia Furian, Dr. Giuseppe Feltrin, currently director of the National Transplant Center, along with past director, to design a new donor exchange program for patients awaiting transplantation in Italy, has been really an immense privilege. This work owes much to Alvin Roth's groundbreaking contribution. However, I must admit that it has been only a partial success, as my children still believe that their mother is more useful to them and society than I am. But without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to a true visionary, an inspiration to scholars and practitioners alike, Nobel laureate Professor Alvin Eliot Roth.
Thank you, Professor Nicolò, and we now welcome Professor Alvin Roth for his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those nice introductions, and thank you for all for coming to listen. So I'm going to, as the various speakers have said, I'm going to talk to you about the design of markets. And market design is indeed an engineering part of economics, and it's a relatively new part of economics. But let me emphasize that the design of markets is an ancient human activity. When archaeologists find stone tools far from where they were quarried and shaped, we know that long before history began, long before writing began, our ancestors knew about markets. They knew how to trade and move things from one place to another. So market design is a deeply human activity. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a book in English called Who Gets What and Why. And the Italian translation, that's the cover there, they translated as matchmaking. And the subtitle was in the economic science of giving to each his own. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about today is about matchmaking and matching markets. But in order to do that, I have to first talk to you a little bit about markets and what are matching markets and what aren't matching markets. So the thing about languages is there are a lot of different languages, so you can translate books into many languages. And markets and marketplaces have a lot in common with languages because they're both tools that human beings make. We don't often think of them this way. I'm speaking to you in English, not because I invented English, but because it's a language that we can speak to each other in, and you speak to each other in Italian. But of course, languages are human artifacts. People make languages, and we have lots of words that aren't ancient words, like clickers and microphones and computers that didn't used to exist. So we modify languages to suit our needs. And similarly with markets and marketplaces. And just as there are many different languages, there's Italian and there's English, there are also many different kinds of markets. And so, as some of the speakers have already said, in many markets, many markets aren't run entirely by prices. And part of the reason is that there are many markets in which you care who you're dealing with. You don't just care about the price, you care also who you're transacting with. And in some of the matching markets that I'll speak to you about today, we don't even let prices do any of the work. But let me start by thinking about a market where prices do all the work. So the New York Stock Exchange is a commodity market. When you buy 100 shares of Microsoft on the New York Stock Exchange, you don't care who you're buying them from. And because you don't care, and because the person who's selling doesn't care who they're selling to, it's easy to communicate with the whole market. You can quote a price. You say, I would like to buy Microsoft stock at this price, and you can offer it to the whole market. Anyone who wants to sell at that price can sell to you. And similarly, someone who's selling stock can name a price, and when the two of you have prices that match, you do a transaction, and you don't worry about who it is you're buying from. You don't even know who it is you're buying from. You don't worry whether they've taken good care of their shares of Microsoft or which shares they have. They're all the same. They're a commodity. And even markets that aren't quite as commodified as the stock exchange, they allow you to choose, many markets allow you to choose whatever you want if you can afford it. So here are Lamborghinis, expensive, fast cars. Not everyone can afford one, but anyone who wants one, who can afford it, can buy one. Okay, and the price is set so that not more people want Lamborghinis than there are, right? And the reason I picked Lamborghinis is later in my talk today, I'm going to talk to you about kidneys. And in the US, at least, we see headlines that say that Italian police use Lamborghinis to transplant kidneys around the country. But kidneys are not like Lamborghinis. When you need a kidney, it has to be matched to you, right? You can't just choose a kidney that you want. The kidney has to want you too. It has to fit you. So that's going to be a matching market that I'll talk to you about. So what are matching markets? Matching markets are markets in which you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it, but you also have to be chosen. And we have all been through lots of matching markets in our lives. Some of you are. Everyone here has been through a matching market because university admissions are a matching market. You can't just attend Stanford University, where I teach. You can't just attend the University of Padua. You have to be admitted. And neither can Stanford or Padua decide which students will come here. They have to compete with Bocconi and with Berkeley. So similarly for labor markets, you can't just decide where you're going to show up for work. You have to be hired. And firms can't just decide who will work for them. They have to offer you a job, and you have choices with other jobs that you could have. So labor markets and college admissions and school choice at a younger age, I'll talk about a little, these are matching markets, and they're a little bit like marriage. So unlike the New York Stock Exchange, where prices do all the work, marriage involves other institutions. It involves courtship, and you can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. So matching markets are going to have other institutions and other work to do than just price discovery. They're not just trying to solve a price. They also have to make matches. Okay, so universities have admissions procedures, applications procedures. Job markets have applications and interviews and offers, and there are a whole lots of market institutions. The design of those markets has to do with the rules about how you make applications, how you do interviews, how you make offers, how long you have to accept them, things like that. Okay, so one of the things that's happened as we move to many markets on the internet, many computer-assisted markets, is computer-assisted matchmaking has taken on some of the role that traditional matchmaking used to have in marriages. So here's a chart that tells you something about American society in the last 80 years. Okay, what it shows is how Americans, this is by some colleagues of mine at Stanford, sociologists, who asked married couples, how did you first meet? And what you see here, what you see here is right now in 2020, the modal way that American couples have met each other is they met online. But that was hardly true in 1940. Okay? In 1940, when you asked people how they met, here are the three big curves. One of them is they met through friends. That one has stayed very lively till today. The other two were they met through family and they met in primary or secondary school. So in 1940, Americans weren't as mobile as we are today. We tended to live where we grew up. But today, Americans move a lot. I live in California. I was born in New York. And that's not unusual for Americans. So the old tradition, the chance of marrying someone who you met in primary school has become very small in the United States. Right? In 1940, there was a reason as you graduated high school, you might think about marrying your high school sweetheart because that's when people were getting married and that's when the marriage market was thick and when you could have a lot of opportunities that might not come again. But that's no longer true. And there was a little while where married couples met at work. That's the green line, met as coworkers. And of course, between COVID and working remotely, that's also become less. So matching is important in markets, it's important in the marriage market, and looking at the outcomes of markets tells us something about the society in which we live, right? So my guess is that the curves are a little different in Italy, where perhaps more people live as adults where they grew up as children. But that's for Italians to figure out. Okay, so now, in addition to marital matchmaking, we have a lot of new kinds of matchmaking. So let's think for a minute about Uber and Airbnb. They're both matchmaking markets, but they're very different from each other because the complexity of the information that has to be conveyed to make a good match is different in Uber and in Airbnb. Uber knows pretty much what you want. You want a ride that will arrive quickly. So Uber doesn't have to ask you a lot about what you want. They have to ask you where you're going, but what you want is a car that's close to you and will come quickly and take you where you're going. So you don't have to communicate a lot with Uber. You don't hear a lot about the drivers. The drivers are close. That's the special thing. Airbnb is much more complex. It's talking about an apartment where you might like to stay. Well, you have complicated opinions about apartments. You don't just want one that's close to you. You might want one that's very far from you because you're traveling. And you might care what the view is like, what the furniture is like, how many stairs you have to climb. You might have lots of information that you need to know to form your preferences. So they're going to have very different communications requirements, and I'll talk a little more about this. But markets respond to technology. So Airbnb started not long after the internet started. It's an internet kind of market, eBay even more so. As soon as you had the internet, you could have eBay. But you couldn't do Uber. You couldn't make Uber with just the internet because Uber needs to know where you are and it needs to know where all the drivers are. So Uber needs global positioning satellites, GPS, and it needs smartphones so that you can carry them with you and ask for a car wherever you are, not in your office where you have a computer. So not only are the matching markets that we're going to talk about shaped by the needs of the match, they're also shaped by the available technology. So let's think, before I tell you a bit about Airbnb, let's think a minute about what marketplaces have to do to make markets work well. And I'm going to speak at various times. Sometimes I'll say marketplaces, and sometimes I'll say markets. And loosely speaking, the way to think about what I mean is a marketplace is a small institution in a large economic environment. So Uber is a marketplace in the big transportation market. Okay? Airbnb is a marketplace in the big temporary residence market. Okay? So the first thing a marketplace has to do to make the market successful is it has to make the market thick. It has to bring enough people together to transact so that it's a good place to go if you want a car, if you want a place to stay, if you want to apply to a college. Okay? So you need lots of people coming together in order for it to be a good place to come. But once you have a lot of people coming together, once the market is thick, there's a problem with congestion. Supposing we all want to do something together, well, it might be hard to arrange because there are so many of us. If we just had to each talk to each other, it would be hard. Think about Amazon. They sell many, many products. If you had to go through them in alphabetical order, that wouldn't be a very efficient way to buy things. But so instead, Amazon has a really good search engine. It has a way to deal with congestion. It's a thick market. It offers many opportunities to transact, but you need a way to find the transactions that you want. Okay, so markets, once they achieve thickness, they have to deal with congestion. And they also have to deal with making themselves trustworthy and safe to transact in. So let's take a look at how Airbnb solved those problems. Okay, so when Airbnb started, it was a website that offered places to stay in San Francisco. So that's not a very promising worldwide market because not everyone wants to stay in San Francisco, and many people would like to offer their houses as places to stay, but they don't live in San Francisco. So what Airbnb did is they started to buy up their competitors, who were other websites like CrashPatter in London. And once they bought CrashPatter, they could offer you places to stay in San Francisco and in London, and they could attract travelers from both places. And as they grew more and more websites, they became a thicker market. They became a place where you could find a place to stay in Verona or in Paris or in New York. But then they had a problem to deal with congestion. And part of that problem, as they got a thicker market, their competitors weren't just other websites, their competitors were hotels. And they had a problem with congestion that hotels didn't have, because many people on Airbnb, many hosts who wanted to invite you to their apartment, had only one apartment to offer, whereas hotels have a lot of rooms. So I'm staying at the Hotel Majestic Toscanelli here in Padua, and think how difficult it would be to reserve a room at the hotel if they would only talk to you about one room at a time. This is the problem that Airbnb hosts have. I want to rent my apartment, but I have only one apartment that I want to rent. So if you're trying to reserve my apartment, you have to get it on a time when it's vacant. So think about if the Hotel Majestic Toscanelli felt that way. You would call them up and you'd say, do you have a room for me for Wednesday night? And they'd say, which room do you want? And you'd say, how about room 101? And they'd say, I'm so sorry, no, it's full. Then they'd hang up, and you'd have to call again, and you'd say, how about room 201? They'd say, oh, room 201, yes, that's available. Okay, so that was Airbnb host's problem. They had only an apartment to offer. When it was an internet site only, you would go to the site and you'd check that you wanted to stay there, and you had to be accepted. But the person who was offering the apartment might have a day job where they didn't constantly check their apartment listings. So when they came home, they might find that 4 people were trying to rent the same apartment for Wednesday night, and they would have to say to you, I'm so sorry, the apartment is full, I gave it to someone else. And then you would have to try again to rent another apartment. So if that had remained their technology, they would never be a competitor to hotels, because hotels would be so much less congested, so much less time-consuming. Okay? So what they did is they speeded up the response time of hosts. They went to smartphones. They instituted instant booking so that someone with a sufficient reputation could book without having to be accepted, to be automatically accepted. And as soon as I tried to reserve an apartment, it disappears from your apps. So there'll never be two of us simultaneously trying to reserve the same apartment. So now you have much, much more chance of being able to treat them like a hotel. You look at what's available and you choose an available apartment. And in terms of trust and safety, of course, travelers want to know that the picture of the rooms that are being advertised look like the actual apartment that's being advertised. So what you see here is apartments available in Padua, and they come with reputations. Here's someone who has a 4.98 reputation. That is, lots of travelers have already stayed at that apartment and they liked it a lot. So that makes it safe for me to try to reserve that apartment. Okay, so Airbnb has done a lot of market design to make their market thick, to deal with congestion, and to make it trustworthy and safe. Okay, so I'm going to tell you now, with that background, that schematic of how marketplaces work, I'm going to tell you about I'm going to tell you a little bit about some markets that I've had a hand in designing, and I'm going to mostly tell you about school choice systems in a number of American cities and kidney exchange. Okay, so these are markets. When I say school choice systems, I'm talking about public schools in big American cities. So children are required by law to go to school in the United States until they are pretty old. And so we have a problem, though, of figuring out which children should go to which schools. And I'll tell you about how we dealt with that. And one reason that's an important social issue is there's a danger that people whose families are poor live in poor neighborhoods and go to poor schools, and that perpetuates urban poverty. So what we would like is to have some opportunity for people to go away from poor schools, go to better schools, even if they live in poor neighborhoods. And that's the motivating thing to think about school choice. And kidney exchange, I'll talk about more. Kidney disease, kidney failure is one of the top 10 causes of death in many, many countries in the world. And there aren't enough kidneys. So, as I think Professor Nicolò said, one of the tasks of economics is to allocate scarce goods efficiently, but another task is to make scarce goods less scarce. And so I'm going to tell you about how economists and have helped transplant professionals, physicians and surgeons, to make kidneys somewhat less scarce. And there's still a lot of work to do, and we can talk about that as well. So let me start telling you a little about school choice in the United States. So we have public school places. By and large, we have enough public school places for every child who needs to go to school, but not every school is equally good for every child. And we don't have to worry about thickness because the law requires children to go to school, but we do have to worry about congestion. And we think that families have some information about which schools are good for their children. So we would like to have school choice systems in which families can participate in the decision of where their children should go to school, because the school that might be good for your child might be less good for my child, and vice versa. So there's valuable information held by families that will help make good assignments of children to schools. Incidentally, that's one of the big tasks that markets perform, is they aggregate privately held information. Right? So people who want Lamborghinis know they want Lamborghinis, and the price helps allocate who drives a Lamborghini. Public schools, parents have some idea about which schools would be good for their children, and we'd like to be able to use that information in the assignment process. Okay? So in order to get that information, we have to make it safe for parents to tell us which schools they think would be good for their children. And as you'll see, that's not always a simple thing to do, to make the market safe for families. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about school choice in different cities, and I'm going to just concentrate today on New York City and Boston. Okay, and they're different from each other, and they're different in ways that are typical of many American cities. In New York City, the principals of each school, the headmasters of each school, play a big role in deciding who they want to come to their school. Whereas in Boston, that's all done by the municipality. The city of Boston, Boston Public Schools, has opinions about which children should go to which school, and the individual schools are not involved in that decision. Okay, so the way New York City schools choice used to work, there are about 90,000 students a year who enter high school in New York. There's about 1.2 million students in the New York City public school systems, but 90,000 of them enter high school each year. And what they used to do before economists got involved was they used to invite students to submit lists of up to 5 choices. So the student and the family would submit a list that said, here's my first choice, here's my second choice, third, fourth, and fifth. And they would reproduce these lists, they would copy them, and they would send them to the high schools that were on the list. And that was your application to high school. Now, one of the problems about having applications look that way is every high school principal saw that you were applying to him and how you had ranked him. So they saw not just that you wanted to go to their high school, but that their high school was your third choice, okay? And so one of the things that happened, and I'll tell you about, is it stopped being safe for people to simply think about what's my first choice, what's my second choice, because some high schools, quite a few in fact, would adopt the policy that we're only going to admit students who list us as their first choice. And what that meant was if your first choice was hard to get into, it might be risky to list it as your first choice because now you'd be wasting your first choice. And instead of it being safe for you to tell the city what was your first choice, you had to think instead of telling the city, of thinking to yourself, what's the best high school I can get into if I say it's my first choice? Which is a very different problem because that involves thinking about what everyone else will say and which high schools are popular and will be over-demanded and which are not. Anyway, to continue with New York City, the high schools would make admissions decisions. They would communicate them to the Board of Education, to the central city. The city would send out letters, but only about 40% of students got initial offers because some students got several offers. Okay, and so after the students who had several offers were informed what their offers were, they had to reply and choose one. And they almost always chose the one that they had said was their higher choice. And then they could send out, then high schools could admit more students because some of the people they had admitted were going elsewhere. And they only had time to do that 3 times, going through the mail and waiting for decisions. And the time-consuming process is waiting for the decisions, not the mail itself. And as a result, come September, when students have to go to school, about 30,000 of these students were left unmatched and had to be administratively matched to high schools that they hadn't expressed any preferences over. Okay, so that was the problem that they came to us with. They said, you know, I got a phone call one day and it said, we have this problem, 30,000 students are being assigned to schools that they didn't make preferences for. So one of the problems I've already told you about is that schools saw the rank order lists, and that meant that it wasn't safe for students and families to list their true preferences. And everyone understood this. This isn't a deep insight. The directory that they distributed to families said, determine what your competition is for a seat in each program that you list. So maybe you shouldn't list as your first choice a school that's hard to get into. Okay? And there were some other funny things going on because remember, they were putting 30,000 students into schools they hadn't applied to. So principals weren't always glad to get students who they hadn't seen their applications. And so principals would find ways of concealing places. They would say, 3 classrooms on our first floor are under construction. We can only admit fewer students this year than we did previously. And then in September, they would discover that they had 3 extra classrooms, and they could start to negotiate with families, not through the centralized system, about who would come. Okay? Now, I'm going to switch for a moment from New York to Boston, because Boston had a different set of problems to solve, but a similar solution. So in Boston, they already had a computerized system when we met them. And they gave, every student had a priority at every school. So you had a high priority, a very high priority at a school. We're talking about small children now, say children going to kindergarten. Your kindergarten child had a very high priority to school if you had an older child who already attended that school, okay? Because the idea was families would just make one drop off. You had another priority, you also had priority if you lived close to the school. And after that, they gave students random priority. And what they did, they really wanted to help the students. So their system was they elicited from families a list, what's your first choice, what's your second choice, what's your third choice. Then they tried to give as many children as possible their first choice. And when some school had more people choosing it as their first choice than it had places, they would order them in priority and give all the highest priority student, the second highest priority, they would all get places until places ran out. And those children would now be assigned to school. And then they would look at all the people who hadn't gotten their first choice and try to give as many of them as possible their second choice. And when they filled all the second choice places that they could, they looked at third choices. Now, you already know, because of what I told you about New York, what could go wrong with a system like this. And what can go wrong is it's not safe to let the city know your true preferences, because if you fail to get the school you ranked first, you might also fail to get your second choice, because your second choice will have filled all its places with people who ranked it first. So you might live across the street from a great half-day kindergarten, but you'd like a full-day kindergarten so that mom can go back to work. But if you list the full-day kindergarten where you don't live so near, you don't have high priority there, you might not get it. And now you won't get your second choice either. But if you had listed your second choice first, you would have gotten it. So you have a complicated decision to think how to communicate with the city. Okay? So let me tell you how we now do school choice in both New York and Boston. And we use an algorithm where in both places we're going to continue to ask families for their preferences, first choice, second choice, third choice. But I'm going to tell you how we now process those preferences. And this is an algorithm for which Lloyd Shapley won the Nobel Prize. David Gale was no longer living in 2012 when we won the Nobel Prize. But Gale and Shapley created this. They didn't create. Algorithms like this had been used before, but they understood what I'm going to explain to you about the algorithm now. Okay, so let me tell you how the algorithm works. And I'm going to describe it as if the students and the schools are doing something. But the way you should understand it for now is I'm describing the internal operations of a computer algorithm. So what the schools and the students are all doing is submitting lists of preferences. That's the choice they have. What should I say as my first choice? If I'm a school, what student should I say as my first choice, second choice, third choice? And if I'm a student, what school should I say as my first choice, second choice, third choice? And what we're going to do is first, the students, and in New York, the schools, privately submit preferences. And I say privately because we're not showing the schools the preferences anymore. We're not allowing schools to say, we'll only admit you if you list us first. The schools aren't going to know where you match them, where you rank them. And then what we have in the computer algorithm, what we have it do is it has each student apply to its first choice, just as they did in Boston. But instead of getting admitted to your first choice if there's room for you, what happens in this algorithm is if there's room for you, the school holds your application. It doesn't reject it. But if there's no room for you, if you're below their capacity in priority, they reject you. But they don't accept the students who they haven't rejected, they just hold them. And that's why this is called a deferred acceptance algorithm, because decisions about acceptance are going to be deferred until the school sees all the applications that might come in. Okay? So how does the algorithm proceed? Every student who was rejected by their first choice now applies to their second choice. And every school, suppose I'm a school, they now get new applications together with the ones they were already holding. And what they do with the new applications is they rank them among the applications they're already holding in their original rank order. They don't care when you apply to them. So if you had very high priority at your second choice school, you'll now have very high priority at your second choice school when you apply to it. And they hold how many they have capacity for, and they reject some who they held before, and those apply. And at every stage, students who were just rejected apply to their next choice, And at every stage, each school keeps the highest priority students who have applied so far and rejects the rest. And the algorithm stops when there are no more rejections. Okay? So first, the algorithm has to stop because nobody ever applies to a school twice, and there are only finitely many schools. So this is an algorithm that stops. What happens when it stops? Well, let me tell you what we would like to happen. What we'd like is that there shouldn't be a school and a student who both would have preferred to be matched to each other than who they were matched to. And what I claim, and what Gale and Shapley proved in their 1962 paper, is that the outcome is stable. There aren't any students in schools not matched to each other who would both prefer to be. So let me prove that for you. I'm going to prove a theorem without any chalk on the board. You just have to listen a little carefully. How do we know that if I go through the algorithm, I'm a student, and I get my third choice, how do we know that, so I get my third choice, it means I would prefer to have gotten my first choice or my second choice. How do I know that they don't prefer me back? Well, how did I get my third choice? First, I applied to my first choice, and they rejected me when they filled their spaces with people they liked better. So I applied to my second choice, and they rejected me when they filled their places with places they liked better. Therefore, the two schools that I would prefer to my third choice don't prefer me. Okay? And in addition, it's safe for, I say workers here because that's a mistake, I should say students, but we use this also to match new doctors to their jobs in the United States. It furthermore has the property that it's safe for me to state my true preferences. And the reason is, if I don't get I can state my true first choice, even though it's risky and I probably won't get in. And when I don't get in, I apply to my second choice, and my chance of getting accepted by my second choice is just as great as if I had said it was my first choice. Because when I apply to my second choice, if I have a high priority there, I go right up to the top of their list where I'm safe. Okay, so this solves those problems, and it means that principals can't get better students by withholding places because the students who aren't admitted to that school don't prefer to be admitted. Okay, so the same, when I say there are no students in schools who both prefer each other, I explained it from the student point of view, but the same thing is true. If I'm a school principal and I would have liked to have you in my school, but you're not, it means you never applied to me. And that means you got accepted at a school that was higher ranked on your list that you preferred to me. So it's safe for families to submit their true preferences, and it's safe for school principals to reveal all their places. And so in the first year of operation, instead of having 30,000 unplaced students who had to be assigned, we only had 3,000. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, but let me show you something more surprising, or was surprising to us, which is that in the subsequent years, we didn't make any changes in the algorithm. Okay, but what changed was the behavior of the students in the schools. And the way they changed was, notice that in the first year, 34% got their student got their first choice, and another 16% got their second choice, and so forth. The next year we used the algorithm, more students got their first choice, and more students got their first and second choice, or first or second choice, and more students got their first, second, or third choice than the first year. The algorithm hadn't changed. And the third year, still more students got their first choice, more got their first or second, and more got their first, second, or third. And then by the fourth year, it started to level out. And what was happening here is that places that school principals used to be withholding started to get included in the system. That is, as people began to trust the market more, principals stopped withholding places because now they couldn't get better students by withholding places. Okay, so that's how we match students to schools in New York City and Boston. And it had some unanticipated effects. That is, it's not just the simple mathematics of what we do, it's also how it changes the behavior of the participants. Okay, so let me move from schools to kidneys and talk a little bit about kidneys now. And this is a great place to talk about kidneys because Italy is a pioneer in some kinds of kidney exchange, and many of the people doing the pioneering work are sitting here. Okay, so let me tell you just generally about kidney transplants. People have two kidneys, and kidney failure can kill you, but since the 1960s, I guess, there's kidney dialysis, which can keep you alive while waiting for a kidney. But the treatment of choice is transplantation. And what I've got here is a picture by country of how many transplantations per million population they do. And transplants can come in two flavors: deceased donors in blue and living donors in orange. And so kidneys are special because healthy people have two kidneys and can remain healthy with one. That means if someone you loved was dying of kidney failure and was on dialysis, and you didn't want them to die on dialysis, you might be able to save their life by donating a kidney to them. But you have to be pretty healthy to be a kidney donor. But that's not enough. You might be healthy enough to be a kidney donor, but not be able to donate a kidney to the person you love. And what I'm going to talk to you about, and one of the things that is being pioneered in Italy is kidney exchange. But this picture is from the Global Observatory on Donation, and I think this is the way that transplant professionals, transplant professionals like to see, because it shows how well you're doing given how big your country is. And so Italy, you see, is well to the right. Italy is doing just fine, whereas China and India have very low transplants per million population. But in my next slide, I want to show you not transplants per million population, but total transplants. And of course, China and India are very big places, so they are numbers 2 and 3 in the world for the number of kidney transplants that get done each year. Right? So the US is still first, but China has almost 1.5 billion people. So there's 1,000 million and a billion. So even though they're not doing many transplants per million population, China has the second most transplants in the world, and India has the third. But notice that China and India, and Brazil has the fourth, and Italy is still pretty high up. Notice that, and Italy's a big country. There are 60 million people who live in Italy. Right? But notice that China and India, the blue and the red, are really different. Right? China is like most countries that do a lot of transplants. They do mostly deceased donor transplants. India does mostly living donor transplants. And kidney exchange, which we're going to talk about, is going to be a way to increase living donor transplants. And for many reasons, it'll be especially important in India because it also involves getting better matched kidneys and therefore suppressing the immune system of the recipient less. And in India, that's a very big deal because when you suppress a person's immune system so that they don't reject a kidney, they also become exposed to other diseases that their immune system would protect them from. And that's a very important issue, especially in India. But what you see here is that size matters. And what I want to talk to you about when I talk about kidney exchange now is that size matters in the European Union also, and there might be better ways to organize kidney exchange in the EU. Okay? But just incidentally, this is one of those markets where we don't allow money to, it's not that rich people buy kidneys from poor people, right? It's against the law just about everywhere in the world, and this is a piece of the American law that says you can't buy a kidney from the donor. There's one exception to that with a legal monetary market, one exception in the world, and that's the Islamic Republic of Iran, where there's a legal market where donors can be paid. And that's a discussion for another time. Okay, so what's a kidney exchange? Well, here, so there's a couple of things that make a kidney a match. Remember, kidneys are going to be a matching market. You can't just choose a kidney, it has to choose you too. And one way it chooses you is you have to be blood type compatible. This is something that actually can be overcome with modern medicine, but at a cost in immunosuppression and a cost in other ways. But let's not worry about that. What you see is donor 1 loves recipient 1 and would like to give her a kidney, but they have incompatible blood types. And donor 2 loves recipient 2 and would like to give him a kidney, but they have incompatible blood types. And what we used to do before kidney exchange is we would send the donors home. We'd say, I'm so sorry, your kidney is not compatible with your patient. Go home. And the patients would remain on the waiting list for a deceased donor, of which there are not enough, and every year many, many people die while waiting for a transplant. So the recipients would just have to continue waiting on the long, dangerous wait list for a deceased donor organ. But what you can see from the picture is we need a blood type A kidney, and we have one. and we need a blood type B kidney, and we have a blood type B donor. So there's an exchange that's possible here, where each patient gets a compatible kidney from another patient's donor. And this is a basic kidney exchange. Okay? Now, it's a congested market because you can't write a contract on a kidney. That's partly what the American law says. And so we do simple exchanges like that simultaneously. So here's a picture of half of a kidney exchange going on in 2006. This surgeon is named Steve Woodall, and he's got in his hospital in Cincinnati a patient and the donor of another patient. And before he's ready to do the operation, he calls up Mike Reese in Toledo, Ohio, who has the other half of the transaction, and he says, we're ready in Cincinnati. We've successfully anesthetized the patients and made the initial incisions. We're ready to go. Are you also? And when he hears that Mike is ready in Toledo, they take out the kidney. Here's the kidney, and they're putting it in here. But right behind me in this picture, not there, but off camera, is another operating room right next door where the nephrectomy, the kidney removal, was conducted. And here's the transplant. And the same thing is going on in Toledo, Ohio. So that means at the same time, we need to be able to organize 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams so that everything happens at the same time. Okay? So that's hard. That's going to be hard to scale to a national market. Okay, so we need to find less congestion. So congestion has to do with when you have lots of transactions you'd like to do, it takes time to do them, and you can't manage to do all the transactions you'd like. So we have to deal with congestion. Okay? Now, one way to deal with congestion a little bit is I'm going to tell you in a moment more about chains. In the US, we have a couple of hundred donors each year now who want to give a kidney to someone and don't have a particular person in mind. And so they can start a chain. And when we started doing chains, we had pictures of 6 people at a time because we would have to organize 3 operating rooms for the nephrectomies and 3 operating rooms for the transplants all at the same time. And that was about, 6 operating rooms was about as many as we could get at one time. But when you have a chain, you can start to ask, do we really have to do them simultaneously? So let me remind you of why we do simultaneous exchanges. What we're worried about, here's a picture of a counterfactual, an exchange between just 2 pairs, as if it were going to be non-simultaneous. We never do that way. But suppose it was, and that on day 1, donor 2 successfully donates a kidney to recipient 1. And on day 2, for whatever reason, donor 1 fails to give a kidney to recipient 2. That's what that dotted red line means. Well, this is a really bad outcome for pair 2. They've had a surgery that didn't help them, and they no longer have a kidney to take part in kidney exchange next week. Okay, so we never do that. We do those simultaneously to make sure that there's no broken link. But now suppose a non-directed donor comes along. Okay, so we have a non-directed donor who wants to give a kidney to someone and doesn't have a particular person in mind. Well, we can point that non-directed donor toward the recipient of some pair, and that pair gets a kidney before they give one, and they're now getting ready to give a kidney to another pair who will also get a kidney before they give one, but for whatever reason, the link breaks. That's very disappointing, but it's not tragic. This pair still has a kidney. They haven't come to any harm. They're no worse off than they were before the non-directed donor appeared, and next week they can participate in another kidney exchange. So the cost of a broken link is much less, and so we can start to try to do them non-simultaneously. And here's the report in the New England Journal of Medicine of the first non-simultaneous chain. And the first author is Mike Reese. He's the guy who was in Toledo, Ohio. He was not in the picture that I showed you in the operation that I was watching. And there were economists and computer scientists in this author. And this is what the exchange looked like at the moment it was published. The top picture is from the New England Journal of Medicine, and the bottom picture is from People magazine, when patients had allowed themselves to be identified. They're anonymous to each other when they go through the exchange. They don't know who they are, but they can meet afterward if they wish, and talk to journalists if they wish. And so this has 20 people in the picture, but the last person in the chain, Helena McKinney, was blood type AB. And that was a mistake. We hadn't fully understood what we were doing. And the reason it's a mistake is it's hard to find in the kidney exchange pool an appropriate pair for her, for various reasons, because she can only donate to a patient who has blood type AB, and that patient is always blood type compatible with her intended donor. So if they're in the kidney exchange pool, it often means that they're hard to match. So it took another 2 or 3 years, I forget, before we found a good match for her, and she was still willing and added another dozen people to the picture. So chains, one non-directed donor can facilitate a lot of transplants sometimes. Not this many typically, but some chains are very long. The average chain in the US is about 5 transplants, so 10 people in the picture. And they're important not just because there are a lot of them, but because they make it possible for hard-to-match patients to be matched. Let me see if I have a picture that would be good for that. No. So let me explain that. So I told you about blood type incompatibility. That's not the thing that makes people very hard to match, because there's lots of people of each blood type. So there are lots of donors of every blood type, although only 4% of Americans have blood type AB. But the way people get hard to match is they have antibodies to human proteins. And that means that if you have antibodies to my proteins, then you can't take my kidney because your body would be ready to attack it. Okay, and again, there are exceptions that can be made to that, but loosely speaking, that's the story. So supposing each one of us represents a pair, a patient-donor pair, where the patient is very hard to match. What's the chance that the donor in my pair can give a kidney to the recipient in your pair? Well, it's very small because your recipient is very hard to match. So in a big room like this, so the chance I can give you a kidney, we can give you a kidney, is very small. But in a big room like this, the chance that we can give someone a kidney is not so small because there's a lot of possibilities. What's the chance that they can give a kidney back to us? That's very small because we're hard to match. But the chance that they can pass it forward to someone else in the room is not so small because there's a lot of people in the room. So when you have a thick market of patient-donor pairs, you can start with a non-directed donor and create a long chain. And so not only are there a lot of transplants in this chain, a lot of the people in the chain are very hard to match. And that means that these are people who wouldn't ordinarily have been able to get a kidney can now get a kidney because the market is thick, so there's a lot of choices, and it doesn't have to be pairwise. There doesn't have to be a double coincidence of wants, and we can get a lot of congestion is also overcome. We can do a lot of exchanges in one chain organization. Okay, so that's great, but we only have a couple of hundred non-directed living donors in the US. On the other hand, deceased donors are almost all non-directed. Mostly when you die, you can't be a donor. Dying, it turns out, is not good for your organs. But you have to die in a hospital on a ventilator. So in the US, it's about 2% of deaths are potentially eligible to be donations. But those are undirected donations that are directed through a waiting list system. A national bureaucracy generates a waiting list for each organ. And one of the things you can ask is, could we use deceased donor kidneys to initiate living donor chains? So here's a paper from 2016 where my co-authors are all surgeons, American surgeons, where we talk about how that might work. And in the US, we're still carefully navigating the bureaucratic barriers to doing that. But here in Italy, you've done that. And so here's a paper, mostly by people, I think by people who are almost all in the room now. So here at University of Padua, they've started to initiate chains with deceased donor kidneys. Okay, and what that means is you can start a chain with a deceased donor kidney, do several transplants, and in the end, the last donor donates to someone who was waiting for a deceased donor kidney and didn't have a willing living donor. Okay, so So the old style would be to take that deceased donor kidney and donate it directly to someone on the waiting list, and each deceased donor kidney would cause one transplant. But at the time they wrote this paper, they had done it 8 times and caused 24 transplants. And Monday I was in Rome and I heard Dr. Furian say that now they've done 25 of these and produced 69 transplants. So it's almost 3 to 1. Instead of getting 1 transplant from 1 deceased donor kidney, they're getting not quite 3. So that's great progress. Okay? There's still a shortage of kidneys in the world. And so we need, partly because there are hard to match pairs, and so we need to make the market thicker. In the United States, we've started to invite people to join American Kidney Exchange from outside the United States. So the foreign pair in this chain is here. The patient is the lady standing next to me in the yellow dress, Marisol Robles. This was a chain that was going to end after this donor with donation to someone on the deceased donor waiting list, but instead some more transplants were able to be done, which saved the life of Mrs. Robles, and also got some more transplants done. The reason, incidentally, there are lots of differences between transplants in the US and in Europe, and one of the reasons is American transplant centers, because of the way they're regulated, are very risk-averse. And the donor here, who was 67, in the United States, that's old for a living donor. It's not necessarily old in medical fact or in Europe. But that's why she would have been the last donor in the chain, and instead the chain continues for several more patients. And so what's going on here is there's mutual benefit in kidney exchange. Everyone gives a kidney and everyone gets a kidney. There's no reason that has to stop at national borders. So there have actually been some controversies about this, but not in Mexico, where the patients' lives were saved. Here's a cover of Newsweek en Español, the Spanish version of Newsweek, and the cover says, transplants of kidneys between the US and Mexico, a bridge of life. And this was at the time when our president was Donald Trump, and he was talking about building walls on the border. And what the article goes on to say is that here are medical professionals and economists helping to build bridges instead of walls. So we think that exchange across borders has real possibilities. And you see it even in places where there are real political difficulties. So a couple of years ago, in 2022, I guess, I went to the UAE in connection with a kidney exchange between Israel and the UAE. And that was a case of 3 pairs. Each patient was a mother who was highly sensitized, because you can become sensitized in childbirth. So in childbirth, after the placenta breaks, the mom's immune system becomes exposed to the proteins, the foreign proteins that the baby has, right? Babies get half their proteins from mom and half from dad. So the mother can become sensitized to both the father of the babies and the children at the same time. So they can't give to each other within the family, but they can find exchanges that allow everyone to get a kidney from a compatible donor. And that's what happened in this first exchange, which involved a Jewish mother and daughter, an Israeli Jewish pair, an Israeli Arab pair, a husband and wife, and a pair in the UAE that only wants to be identified as Arab residents of the UAE, but they were also a mother and a daughter. So these barriers can be overcome. Now, in India, they've done a little bit of exchange too with Portugal, but they don't do. But it's hard to do many exchanges if the way you organize your international exchanges is by first matching as many people as you can within your country, and then seeing if across countries you can match to other people, because now you have a very thin market made exclusively of very hard to match patients. Okay? So there's been, but nevertheless, actually, before I talk about international, but even when you can't use the kind of tricks I've showed you here with chains, in India, they don't allow, by and large, they don't allow non-directed donors. But there's a magician, a transplant nephrologist in the state of Gujarat, who's been organizing non-simultaneous cycle exchanges. And in black are all the pairs that gave a kidney before they get one. And he has complicated plans in place to make it reliable. If one of the links breaks, he's going to be able to take care of those. Those aren't hard to match pairs. He'll be able to take care of them with a deceased donor kidney, but hasn't had any problems so far. But instead of having patients be anonymous, he takes a page from the book on microfinance and has everybody involved get together before the chain starts and agree that they're all in this together and they're all going to help each other. And they all do. So people are very much nicer than economists sometimes give us credit for. And that's one of the things we see in kidney exchange is that although you can't write binding legal agreements, people are pretty reliable in going through on their commitments, especially because the nurses don't nominate everyone to do an exchange after a donation after a delay. The nurses have to think you're reliable in order for you to be giving donating a kidney after your recipient has already gotten one. Okay, so, and the technology in India is very good. Okay, so what are some of the political issues going forward? Well, the World Health Organization seems to think that every country should try to be self-sufficient in organs, in transplants. And that's less, harms the conscience less for deceased donors than for living donors, but as we've seen, even with deceased donors, it's going to make sense to be in a big country where there are lots of, where the market is thick, okay? And notice that we don't require countries to be self-sufficient in general. So to economists, the idea that countries should be self-sufficient seems very strange. We don't require countries to be self-sufficient in food. When there are famines, we ship food. We don't tell countries they should strengthen their agricultural sector. When we don't require countries to be self-sufficient in medicines. When there's a pandemic, we ship vaccines. We don't tell countries they should build a better pharmaceutical industry. One place where we do effective international exchange is in bone marrow, blood stem cells, which are treatment for certain kinds of diseases of the blood, like leukemia. And there's an effective worldwide registry that looks for perfect matches so that sometimes people can be saved even when their blood stem cells aren't working properly anymore. And one thing to remember in all this is that markets are human artifacts. They're tools, and mostly they aren't commodity markets. And we need to consider together how to make markets work better, how to fix them when they're broken. And right now, around the world, there's a shortage of organs for transplant, but this is something that we might be able to fix. So I think I'm gonna draw to a close here and say thank you.
Thank you, Professor Roth. There will now be an opportunity to ask Professor Roth a few questions. He will be joined by Professor Nicolò, who will chair this Q&A session. Thank you.
Good.
Thanks again to everybody. So I believe that this talk was extraordinarily interesting for most of the audience and the students. And I first would like to ask someone to break the ice, and if you have any questions to ask to Professor Roth, please raise your hands and do your questions to Professor Roth. Thanks.
Okay, this is okay. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you very much, especially the latest part about kidney exchange globally. I was thinking, can be there some risks also of doing something globally, especially when the quality of, for example, the physician staff or of the hospital can be very different across countries?
Well, so I think I've got my own microphone, thanks. Sure, there are risks. There are risks also doing domestic exchanges. There's no guarantee that things will work. So we'd have to think about protocols for how to do the exchange. The people, the patients and the donors and the people doing the transplants and the people taking care of them after the transplant will all have to have agreements on the plan of treatment, absolutely. And that can be different in different places. We already had that in the United States, where we have many different hospitals, and there was early discussion of whether my hospital could accept a donation from your hospital for my patient that looked good to us, but that you wouldn't have done that transplant at your hospital. And we had to convince people that you're not doing that transplant at your hospital. You know, our safety record is just as good as yours. We think that's a good transplant. So lots of discussions that have to go on. The obstacles to cross-border exchange are not small. Canada has excellent kidney exchange, but so far the US and Canada don't cooperate with each other because of bureaucratic difficulties.
Thank you, Professor Roth, for your fascinating presentation. Now, because we've been talking about kidneys, as a sociologist of education, I was struck by both examples, but what I understood better was the former, about the school choice. And now I understand your model addresses the problem of allocation, you know, of improving the likeliness that people get what they want, exactly. Now, a problem we have, I think in the US, but also in Italy, there are studies about some Italian cities that are revealing we have a big problem of school segregation. And why is this interesting? Because this is the reason some people are, you know, claiming that there should be no choice at all. Just to avoid. Now, what I find fascinating is I think your model could address such a problem, and so that we can design a market that could address the problem of segregation while not abolishing choice, but designing choice in such a way that school segregation is prevented. So I understand this is a big question, but if you could just tell us something or hint at something that can address this problem. Thank you very much.
Okay, so in the US, this goes under the loose heading of affirmative action. And loosely speaking, one of the things we can do is we can treat each school as if it were several schools. And there can be different priority orderings, different preferences for the schools for people from different, by gender, by ethnicity, by socioeconomic status. So this is how we try to handle this. That is, when you look inside the algorithm for New York City, some schools are broken up into 4 parts, and essentially each of the 4 parts has its own priority for students. And that's invisible to the students. When you're admitted to the school, you don't know where in the algorithm your admission came from, but that's how we try to handle it. Now, affirmative action causes mathematical problems in the properties that these algorithms have. In particular, if you knew all the categories of people who you wanted to balance and could separate them all into distinct categories, the algorithm would work the way I told you. But in fact, some people have both a race and an ethnicity and a gender, right? So all of a sudden, you're looking at people who you have to decide if you want gender balance, do you want also to have racial balance by gender, things like that. So those cause complications in the situation. There are countries that have more complicated affirmative action problems than we do in the United States. India comes to mind, where there are more categories of people, both by ethnicity, by caste, and by socioeconomic status. So there's exploration going on in all those places about how to make the social concerns to integrate schools still use the information that families have about which schools would be good for their children.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My question is more about when you want to have a thick market, if I've understood correctly, you need a lot of participants. And in the case of marketplaces like that of kidneys or other very important, very sensitive things, I feel like it's possible that it's very difficult to make people participate into this market because it's difficult to explain and to get the people to trust this market if they don't understand it. So since you cannot explain to each participant how the algorithm works and convince them this is a reliable, fair way to operate, how do you think we could get people and, say, for example, get the European Union to collaborate in this by getting people to trust the system?
Okay, that's a great question, and it's a really practical problem. So the first year we had the new school choice system in Boston, we sent to families a brochure that explained a little bit the way I've explained to you what was going on. And we had a phone number of someone who worked for Boston Public Schools, and we said, if you have any questions, you can call this number. And so as school choice day approached, he started getting calls, and he said the calls, people call me and they say, is it true, did I understand correctly, that it's safe for me to list my first choice and I won't suffer from this? And he'd say, yes, you've understood correctly. And then the person on the phone would say, the reason I ask is the nice ladies at the school information center are saying you have to be very careful to pick your first choice. So the advice that people were giving to parents was still the advice from the old algorithm. And so it took a while before parents started to understand that it was indeed safe. Now, one of the areas of research that economists are now engaged in is how can we truthfully describe these algorithms in ways that make it even clearer that it's safe to use, that you shouldn't have to, and sometimes that can't be done. So sometimes they just have to say, you know, people study these things, they wrote papers about them, experts understand it, you should trust us. And you'd have the feeling that in the old days when the algorithm wasn't safe, the newspaper columns were full of advice. That is, people knew it wasn't safe. And that now that you don't see that, you think, well, maybe experts understand it and other people do too. But there's definitely work, current work, very current work, at how we can describe these algorithms that make them more transparent. So people are doing experiments with different explanations, things like that. And early on, my colleagues and I thought that our job was to create good algorithms and give them to school systems. But now we understand that our job is to create good algorithms and good communication packages, which is still a work in progress.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, do you think this kind of choice, of multiple choice, could be used in political expression situations? For example, let's say you have 10 candidates for a spot, but only 2 are the big ones.
I'm having trouble hearing you. I'm sorry, I hear through hearing aids, so.
Sorry. I was wondering, do you think the method of multiple choice could be used in political voting situations? Because sometimes you have, for example, 10 candidates for a spot, but 2 candidates are the big ones, and the votes of people tend to converge there because they're afraid of wasting the vote by voting for a small candidate. Do you think a multiple choice could solve this issue?
So that's a great question. The question is, what about market design for voting systems? How should we count the votes? Should we have, instead of having people just cast a vote for one person, maybe they should have a rank order list. Here's my first choice, my second choice, my third choice. So there's a famous theorem in economics called Arrow's general possibility theorem, which says that there will be flaws. It says that any system you use will look different than choices by individuals, unless your system of governance is a dictatorship in which the choices are made by an individual. So in answer to your question, I think that there are rank order systems that might better reflect the preferences of Americans in their recent elections. For instance, it was quite a surprise in 2016 when Donald Trump won the Republican nomination. And loosely speaking, the story there is lots of Republicans had him as their last choice. but there was a big enough group that had him as their first choice that he won Republican primaries. But if instead you had a system that said, when your first choice is knocked out, we'll elevate your second choice to your first choice and count again, that would have produced a different outcome. So there's certainly room to think about things like that, but of course they're not independent of irrelevant alternatives. The outcome depends not just on what people's preferences are, but on who the candidates are. And so that has other problems, and you could create scenarios where you might prefer single voting to multiple voting. But it's an active subject of discussion in the United States, and a number of municipalities have adopted rank order voting in one form or another.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I have two questions. First, I wanted to ask, when you mentioned the algorithm for the places in the school, is there some optimal percentage of places that you want to reserve for each stage, or it's different for different settings, for example?
So it's very different for different cities. You know, municipal politics revolves a lot around school choice. And in a year when I have a child going to kindergarten, what I think is a good school choice system is a system that sends my child to the school we prefer. So of course you can't satisfy everyone all the time, but part of what we try to do when we help schools have school choice systems is sort of say to them, think of the school choice system as a machine with many levers. And the basic machine should make sure that however you set the levers, it's safe for people to put in their true preferences, and you get a stable matching so that people will actually go to the schools they're assigned to. But that you can move the levers around and decide how many spaces you should reserve for people who live within the walk zone, how many spaces you should observe for affirmative action of various sorts. So I think pretty much every year municipal school systems move the levers around based on what happened last year. How many children got to walk to school, how many had to take a bus, how many got to study the foreign language that their parents wanted them to study, things like that. But the basic properties of the algorithm that I told you about stay the same even when they move those levels around.
Okay, makes sense, thank you. And the second question, for the kidney transplants, do you think there is some hope for the international organization that will facilitate the exchange of the kidneys? Because I think it will make much efficient if we have like a communication between many hospitals through one body and not the hospital-to-hospital agreements.
So there are lots of bureaucratic obstacles, but right now there's a limited amount of international exchange, but it's very limited. So Italy, Spain, and Portugal show each other sometimes their hardest to match pairs. But this leads to very few matches because Italy, Spain, and Portugal all match as many people as they can domestically, leaving only very hard to match pairs. But especially when you talk about transplants chains begun by deceased donors, having lots of deceased donors to choose from will allow hard to match patients to be accommodated. And so in the US, as I said, we're starting to see that it's worthwhile for us and for some of our neighbors to invite patients into US kidney exchange. If the EU had a common kidney exchange, you're bigger than the US, the EU would be a very big center in ways that a country like Italy with only 60 million people and therefore only a certain number of people in kidney exchange is maybe too small to be efficient. Just as in the US with 330 million people, we're too small to be efficient. So kidney disease is a global problem and it needs global solutions. That doesn't mean they'll be easy to do. Lots of coordination will have to happen. But within the EU, where national healthcare systems are much more alike each other than the US and Canada, I think it might be easier to start a worldwide kidney exchange in the EU.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the talk. A question to the school matching in, I think it was New York. You showed that diagram that showed the number of students who got their first, second, third choice, and it leveled out in 2004 with 40-something%. What happened since then? Did you modify the algorithm and did that an improvement on that number?
Oh, no. There are limits to how far you can get on that number. You know, New York, I didn't show you the full detail of the New York City school system, but there's a group of schools that are sort of elite schools that admit by exam places. And there are just limited number of spaces in those schools. So if, you know, so many people think that Stuyvesant High School is one of the best high schools in New York. It's an exam school. It has limited capacity. There's a non-exam school, you know, in the data I was showing you that's called Townsend Harris High School. It's on the campus of Queens College. They have limited capacity. Lots of people could have Townsend Harris as their first choice. We can't increase the capacity of the school by changing the algorithm. What we can do is we can make it safe for you to try to get into Townsend Harris without risking the places at the schools that you're more likely to go to. But the, you know, schools have limited capacity, and some schools might be more desirable than others.
Okay, let's have time for the last question.
Hi, I want a question regarding the implementation of matching methods in social media. What is your opinion about it? Because Facebook and Twitter developed the algorithms to match people's idea, but at the same time people need to be exposed to ideas that are different to their beliefs, otherwise this can create polarization. So I'm interested in your opinion about if it is possible matching theory to be implemented in social media. And then if you have time...
So I'm sorry, I was having trouble understanding you. So I understand you're asking about matching in social media, but I didn't quite catch the connection.
Okay, so my question is regarding the implementation of matching theory on social media. Because Twitter and Facebook implemented algorithms to match people's beliefs regarding politics, whatever. But at the same time, some political science says that this is creating polarization. So I'm wondering what is your opinion if matching theory can do something about it.
Okay.
Then if you have time, I have a second question that is regarding your opinion about the job market for economists. So people apply, I know that you suggested signaling. People apply for, I've seen places saying that they receive 600, 800 applications. People apply for places that they do not attempt to accept jobs. I'm asking you if you have further suggestions to improve the matching between universities and PhDs.
Okay, so two questions, one about social media and one about the job market for economists. So I'm not a student of social media, but I have colleagues, and many economists are now thinking about that, and your question was about polarization. And one of the things where, you know, people are trying to understand is to what extent is news entertainment? And that is, how much do you choose the news you read by how much you enjoy reading it? And if that's part of the way you choose your news, then we might be in a world where right-wing voters only listen to right-wing news and left-wing voters only listen to left-wing news. And particularly on Facebook, where you can indicate what you like and what you don't like, you might find yourself getting a very different view of the world than someone else. And I think that's a real phenomena. I don't know that we have good ways to measure it yet, let alone to regulate it. But when you look at different kinds of social media, you see different kinds of moderation, different kinds of recommendation systems. So lots of social media are worried about misinformation and try to not elevate that the same way as good information. I think that's a subject people worry about, but I agree with you that there's a potential danger of real polarization coming from the way we link to each other in social media. Your second question is of a different sort, if I understood correctly. So we just got through the market for new PhD economists, right? So each year we grant PhDs to a bunch of economists, and many of them would like to be professors, and others would like to go to Silicon Valley and work for tech firms, things like that. And the question is, if each job advertisement gets many applications, we have a congested market because reading applications takes time, conducting interviews takes time. And so a department like mine at Stanford, when we have a position, we might get hundreds of applications for it, but we can typically only interview 20 or 30 people because of the time and effort it takes to interview people. And then of those 20 or 30, this year we invited 10, I think, to come visit us at campus and give seminars to the whole faculty. So that's also very costly. Your colleagues get upset with you if you invite too many people to give job market seminars. So one of the tools we've introduced in the North American market for academics is to allow people to send signals. And the American Economic Association, so what do I mean by congested? What I mean is there are many applications that look interesting, but we can only interview a relatively small subset, and we can only invite an even smaller subset to campus. How do we choose those subsets to investigate intensively? So one of the things that we do is the American Economics Association makes available a signaling mechanism that we allow new PhDs to choose 2 jobs to signal to. The AEA takes care of the signaling, and it says, Antonio has chosen your 2 universities to use his 2 signals for. So you should understand that he has some particular interest in your university that you might not have thought of. You might have thought that maybe he wasn't interested in you, but now you know that he is. And that helps spread the interviews among people more than they are when we don't have such signals. Now, recently, there's been the same kind of congestion in the medical market, the market for medical residents in the United States. And each medical specialty, many medical specialties, have adopted signalings to residency programs. And some use very few signals, like the way we do in economics. So internal medicine, I think, has only a small set of signals. But orthopedic surgery and otolaryngology, they allow people to send 30 signals. And so when you send 30 signals, that starts to act as a cap on applications, because as an employer, as a director of a residency program, I might decide if you have 30 signals and you don't send me one, that's a signal itself. That means that even though you had 30 signals, you didn't send me one, so there's no reason for me to interview you. So these things are just 1 or 2 years old in the American medical market, but we're going to see how those things work and understand more about how signaling interacts with congestion.
So I think that now it's time to thanks again Professor Roth, and I think that was a wonderful talk, and we really thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.